We've talked about the step-by-step method of translation, and we've looked at some examples for how to do that. There are going to be some examples that won't work so easily if we just take the English sentence as is and start using the step-by-step method of translation. So what I'm going to show you in this video lecture is sometimes for the English sentences, we actually have to first paraphrase them and then apply the step-by-step method of translation. So let me illustrate this with an example that we also see in the textbook. And these are called donkey sentences, and we'll see in a moment why these are referred to as donkey sentences. So if we look at the English sentence, if a freshman takes a logic class, then he or she must be smart. So if we think about what the sentence looks like, just sort of the surface level logic, looks like it's a conditional. So we might want to say, okay, we're going to translate this part first, and then we're going to translate that consequent second. And so what we might end up getting as a translation, if we apply this the step-by-step method translation to that, is this sentence: there exists a freshman, and there exists a y such that y is a logic class, and if x takes y, then x is smart. The problem here is that the scope of this existential quantifier up front finds all the instances of x that go from this parenthesis all the way up to this one right here, right, to the end of the antecedent. The problem then is that this instance of x over here at the end is now free. And if you have a free variable, that means it's not, in fact, a sentence. This would be a well-formed formula, but we need to bind this instance of a variable. So you might think, okay, how do I fix this? Maybe I'll just extend the scope of the quantifier to include that. And so you might think, okay, sorry, let me back up. If you remember the way that we talked about existential quantifiers and the use of the conditional, the use of the conditional is like the negation of the antecedent and then the consequent together as a disjunction. And we won't get a nice translation for that. What we actually want to do is sort of paraphrase what the English sentence is saying first. So if we think about what the English sentence is saying and we paraphrase it in a sort of more semi-logical format, we might get something like this. What we're trying to say is every freshman that takes a logic class must be smart. So what we've done here is taken this this conditional phrase: if a freshman takes a logic class, then he or she must be smart. Right? What we're trying to say here, especially in this antecedent, is anything that satisfies the condition of being a freshman that is taking a logic class. Notice there that there's sort of this hidden quantifier here that's being used. And what we've done in this paraphrase is made that explicit. We've said every freshman that takes a logic class, right, that's now the noun phrase, must be smart, right? Just this part. That is the verb phrase. So now with that translation, we get something, if we use the step-by-step procedure, we would get something that looks like this. For all x, right, we're saying every x that matches the condition of being a freshman, and if there exists a y that is a logic class, and x takes that logic class, this is now all embedded in the antecedent, then x is smart. And notice that now this variable is bound by that universal quantifier out front. So this would now be an actual sentence in first order logic, and in fact, this would be a correct translation. And the other thing to notice is that once we've paraphrased this sentence, if a freshman takes a logic class, then he or she must be smart. Once we've paraphrased that into this universally quantified sentence in English, right now it becomes easier to use the step-by-step method translation to be able to come up with the first order logic equivalent of it. So we have to be a little bit careful, right? As we've said several times in the class, just because you have certain words in English that look like they could be translated into their logical equivalents, we have to be really careful to recognize what exactly is being expressed. So the classic example that we've often talked about is the word and. Sometimes it expresses a conjunction, and sometimes it doesn't, right? If we said, John and Sally lifted the piano, that's not to be read as John lifted the piano and Sally lifted the piano. What we're trying to say is that together John and Sally lifted the piano. So just because you saw the word and doesn't mean that automatically it's a conjunction. Same thing here, right? Just because you see a sentence that sort of looks really simple in terms of expressing a material conditional, like an if-then statement, it's actually hiding some universal quantification. And so we first need to paraphrase the English sentences to make it clear what the various logical language is that's being expressed. And when we do that, we get this English paraphrase first. And now, once we're happy with how we've paraphrased it, now we can apply the step-by-step method of translation. Okay, so why are these called donkey sentences? Well, there's a notorious kind of sentence that needs to be paraphrased before we can actually apply the step-by-step method of translation. And this famous phrase is, every farmer who owns a donkey beats it. So because this is about, it looks like the sentence is about farmers, but in fact, this is a sentence about donkeys, which is why these are called donkey sentences. So let's see how the step-by-step method goes wrong if we're not careful to first paraphrase this. If we apply the step-by-step method of translation, we would have something like every farmer, right? Kind of like what we have up here with every freshman. And then we would say something like, okay, there exists a donkey, in the same way as we say there exists a logic class. And then we would say, okay, that donkey is owned by the farmer. And then we would say there's a condition that is then met, which is that the farmer beats that donkey. So what we might end up with, if we apply the step-by-step method translation, is this. For all x is, when x is a farmer and there's just a y, where y is a donkey, and x owns y, then x beats y. The first thing to notice about this translation is that the occurrence of y here is in fact free. So if you compare this up here, right, with our every freshman takes a logic class must be smart example, this x is bound by this quantifier out here. But the existential quantifier in this sentence actually only goes up to that point in the translation, right? It's part of the antecedent of the universal quantifier, right? The antecedent of the universal quantifier goes from here all the way out to there. So if we apply that same strategy, what you'll notice is that this instance of y is no longer being bound because the existential quantifier actually only goes up to this point in the conditional, right, or in the antecedent of the conditional. So this is not even in fact a sentence because y is free. Now if we try to move the parentheses maybe to capture this, then we would actually end up with something very different, right? If you just simply move out this parenthesis right here, say we move that all the way out to the outside, what you would actually get is a sentence that would be equivalent to this sentence, right? Which now would have a conjunction. This sentence says that everything in the domain of discourse is a farmer who owns and beats a donkey. And that is in fact not what we're saying. We're not saying that everything in the domain of discourse is a farmer and owns a donkey and beats that donkey. Right? What we're saying is that what we're trying to say in the English language is that every farmer that owns a donkey, right, ends up beating that donkey. It doesn't mean that everybody is a farmer. You might have mechanics or professors or other individuals. And you might also have donkeys that are owned by farmers as well. Okay, so taking a step back then, let's think again about what is being said by this particular sentence. As horrendous as we might find it with not finding acceptable to beat donkeys, that aside, if we're thinking about what is actually being said, what we recognize is that this sentence is actually about donkeys, not about farmers. What we're saying is that all donkeys that are owned by a farmer are beaten by that farmer. So to paraphrase what we then, this original sentence, what we really get is something like this. Every donkey owned by any farmer is beaten by that farmer. So there's actually two universal quantifiers in this sentence. So when we translate that using the step-by-step method, what we're saying, right, what we first need to do is do a translation for every donkey. And then we want to say, okay, anything that is a donkey, this is now the verb phrase. Right? So if we use the step-by-step translation, what we would do is translate this part first. Right? So we would again have the universal quantifier up front and say that X is a donkey, and have this be the second part of the translation, right? We would first treat that as its own unit. And then we would translate that owned by any farmer is beaten by them. We would say, oh, for all Y, where Y is a farmer, and Y owns X, in that condition, or if that condition is met, then Y beats X. So the completed version looks like this, right? Every donkey, so that's what we have here, for all X, if X is a donkey, then we're going to say, okay, for all Y, where Y is a farmer and Y owns X, that's what we have here. For all Y, where Y is a farmer and Y owns X, now we're going to say some relation between Y and X, namely that Y beats X. So the key point here is that when we look at English sentences that have multiple quantifiers in it, we can't just go apply the step-by-step method of translation. What we first need to do is sort of paraphrase, rephrase the English sentence to make clear what the noun phrase is and what the verb phrase is, and order things appropriately first. Right? That's the key idea with this paraphrasing, is we need to order the English sentences and paraphrase things before we start the step-by-step method translation. Because the way that the step-by-step method translation works is by sort of moving from left to right. And so if we just look at the surface level of the English sentence, we might actually end up getting an incorrect translation because we haven't sort of first made sure that the English sentence that we're translating is already in the correct order of having that sort of noun phrase and the verb phrase, and that the quantifiers are in the appropriate order that we need them to be in by thinking about what is intended to be expressed. Okay, so in exercise 11:18, you're going to see examples where you have to do this type of paraphrasing first before you end up doing the step-by-step method of translation.